Hello, I am Dr. Ron Traylor. Welcome back to Political Science 201. And this is the beginning of video lecture number 9. Now, in the previous lectures, we talked about powers given to the Congress by the Constitution. But I would not have you believe that the power given to Congress is limitless. As a matter of fact, there are limits to what the Congress can and cannot do. And we are now beginning Article 1, Section 9, and Article 1, Section 9 deals with a specific topic. What are the limits on the powers of the Congress? The Congress. All right, Article 1, Section 9, Paragraph 1 says, the migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by the Congress prior to the year 1808. A tax or duty may be imposed on such importation, not exceeding $10 for each person. Now, what in the world is that? Well, let me spoil the story for you. And I will tell you that that is the ban on the Atlantic slave trade. Now, do you recall that I told you that nowhere in the original Constitution does the word slave or slavery exist? There you go. We just banned the Atlantic slave trade without using the words Atlantic slave trade. The writers of the Constitution tap danced all around that topic. But if you read it carefully, using very general language, that's exactly what they've just done. Because it says that the migration or the importation, of course, that's the important word, the importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit. In other words, slavery was determined on the existence of slavery. Whether slavery would exist or would not exist was left up to the state, the individual states. A state could ban slavery, or a state could support slavery. And what Section 9, Paragraph 1 says is that the states now existing shall think proper to admit. In other words, if the state thinks it's okay to bring in slaves from Africa across the Atlantic Ocean, they can do it. But let's read a little further. Shall not be prohibited by the Congress prior to the year 1808. So, Congress, the Constitution cannot ban the institution of, cannot ban the Atlantic slave trade prior to the year 1808. But the assumption here is that they can ban it after 1808. The migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by the Congress prior to the year 1808. But a tax may be imposed on such importation not exceeding $10 for each person. The Constitution gives to the national government the right to tax slaves that are Africans that are brought into the country prior to the year 1808. Now, I will tell you this. I have never found any evidence that this tax was ever imposed. So, really what happens is that until 1808, Africans can be brought into the United States, enslaved in the United States, with fundamentally no danger to the southern states for being taxed on the slaves. Now, what happens on the 1st of January, 1809? Well, that is the day that the ban on the Atlantic slave trade goes into effect. Legally, constitutionally, the last day that slaves can be brought into the country constitutionally is December 31st, 1808. Starting at midnight on January, when it goes to January the 1st, 1809, the ban goes into effect. We mentioned earlier that Americans have always been willing to disobey laws with which they disagreed. And the same was true of the ban on the Atlantic slave trade. When the ban went into effect, that means that legally, constitutionally means that no other Africans will be permitted to enter the country. But there was a lot of money to be made in bartering, selling, and buying and selling human flesh. That is something that we have real difficult wrapping our brains around these days. But in the latter part of the 1700s, the early part of the 1800s, up until January 1st, 1809, that was a very normal part of life to bring in these poor devils and enslave them. And because there were huge profits to be made, um, ship owners and ship captains were more than willing to try to smuggle in slaves. Now, if they were caught, the consequences were serious. But if they were able to run the blockade and make it into port, the profits that they were able to make were absolutely huge. All right, there you go. Article 1, Section 9, Paragraph 1 does away with the Atlantic slave trade. Now, one other thing before we leave Section 9, Paragraph 1, every part, and I think I've told you this already, but it bears repeating, every single solitary part of the Constitution, as written in 1787, went into effect immediately upon at the moment that the ninth state ratified the Constitution, with one exception, and it's right here. This part of the Constitution did not go into effect for another 20 years. 20 years after the Constitution was ratified. It was ratified in 1789. Therefore, the ban goes into effect in 1809. Article 1, Section 9, Paragraph 2. The privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless when in cases of rebellion or invasion the public safety may require it. Okay. Habeas corpus. That's a Latin phrase that very simply means where is the body? Where is the body? And a writ is simply a law. Okay, that's a fancy word for a law. A writ of habeas corpus. This is a habeas corpus law. Now, one of the most precious rights that Englishmen had, and therefore Americans had, because remember, we were considered to be Englishmen with the rights of Englishmen, so we had all the rights, theoretically, that the British did. And one of these rights was to have to be charged with a crime before you could be held for a crime, or you could be held in jail for a considerable period of time. Let me say that again. In order to be held for a considerable period of time, um, the person who is accused of a crime must be charged with a crime. Now, why is this important in the early part of the United States? Why is this written into the Constitution itself? Well, it's rather simple. Um, In England, this right had been abused for years and years and years. Yes, on paper, if you were an Englishman, you had the right of habeas corpus. You had the right to be charged with a crime, or they had to turn you loose. Well, in England, quite often, political opponents of the king or political opponents of the parliament would be arrested and thrown in jail. Now, if habeas corpus was treated correctly, what then should have happened? Well, they would have been charged, right? But no, they were arrested, they were thrown in jail, but they were not charged. They were kept in jail where they rotted. And why was this done? It was to silence political opposition. If your political opponent has been arrested and thrown in jail and he's not been charged, which means he's going to stay there forever, that's an effective way to silence your political opposition, isn't it? And this had been going on in England, and the colonists were very much aware of this. The citizens of the new nation of the United States were very much aware that this had happened in England, and we wanted to make sure that it never happened here. So it says, the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended. And then the word unless appears here. So there are a couple of exceptions under which the writ of habeas corpus can be suspended. And what are they? Unless when in cases of rebellion or invasion, the public safety may require it. Let me give you a couple of examples of how this has been, habeas corpus has been suspended in the past. And both of these examples come from the United States Civil War. There were one of the two exceptions in cases of rebellion, right, or invasion. The Not all people who lived in the northern states um, were opposed to the southern philosophy before the Civil War began. There were, in other words, there were people who lived in the north who supported the South. And these people, one of the names that was given to these people, they were called Copperheads. Now, if any of you have ever squirrel hunted in the fall, you know that you're if you're going to be if you're going to keep yourself out of danger, you need to keep as much eye on the ground as you do up in the trees looking for that squirrel, because there is a snake, a poisonous snake, related to a cottonmouth moccasin and a rattlesnake. It's a pit viper called the copperhead, and the markings on the copperhead are really, really effective. Sometimes you literally can't see that thing until you're stepping on it. So, um, uh, people who lived in the North, who supported the South, were there was a derogatory term that was used to describe them. They were called copperheads because they were laying there in plain sight, but you couldn't see them, right? And they could do a lot of damage. So, copperheads. President Abraham Lincoln was very afraid because many of these copperheads were very vocal. And Lincoln was very afraid that these people who lived in the North but supported the South might change the minds of other people who lived in the North and would hurt the war effort against the Confederacy. And so, what did Lincoln do? He suspended the writ of habeas corpus. He arrested many of these so-called copperheads, put them in jail, didn't charge them with anything, and there they sat in jail. Now, Lincoln, uh, about the time the war ends, he frees all these guys. Okay, they don't stay in jail forever, but he does this in order to, at least theoretically, prevent the copperheads from causing further problems in the North, and that would qualify as an exception under the where it says, unless when in cases of rebellion. Now, you may or may not be aware, you've heard the Civil War called many things. You might have heard it called, well, the Civil War. You also might have heard it called the War between the States. Um, Officially, the Civil War is considered by the United States government as a rebellion, and because it considers it a rebellion, and because the Constitution says that the writ of habeas corpus can be suspended in cases of rebellion, that's the first example of how the writ of habeas corpus can be legally suspended. Second example of how it can be suspended is an invasion. If the United States is invaded, the writ of habeas corpus can be suspended to silence those who support the invasion. Now, uh, at the beginning of the American Civil War, the Southern Confederate armies invaded into the state of Maryland. There were mixed feelings in Maryland. Some people supported the Union, some people supported the Confederacy. Many of the people who supported the Confederacy did so very actively, and did everything they could think of to help the Confederate cause when the Confederates invaded Maryland. And so, what did Lincoln do here? Well, he does something similar as to what he did with the Copperheads. He arrests many of these Southern sympathizers in Maryland, puts them in jail, does not charge them with anything. So, there you have two examples, both from the Civil War, both involving Abraham Lincoln, with regard to the ways to constitutionally suspend the writ of habeas corpus. Article 1, Section 9, Paragraph 3 says no bill of attainder or ex post facto law shall be passed. All right. Let's break the let's break that into two pieces. We'll define what a bill of attainder is. We'll also define what an ex post facto law is. A bill of attainder is best understood as a legislative punishment without a trial. So you are arrested and you're charged with a crime. Now, see the difference already. With habeas corpus, you're never charged with a crime. But with a bill of attainder, you are in fact charged with a crime, but you're never brought to trial. Now, why was this in the Constitution? Well, for a similar reason to why the writ of habeas corpus was in the Constitution. This was something that was rather common in England. Once again, it was a tool by which the political enemies of the king and the parliament could be silenced. So, you've got a political enemy, and you arrest him, and you charge him with whatever. Charge him with treason. I don't care what you. Okay, charge him. Charge him with having an ugly haircut. It doesn't matter. He has been charged. So he's been arrested, he's been charged, and he's in jail. The problem is the case never comes to trial. He just rots away in prison without the benefit of a trial. And of course, the right to a trial of a jury of your peers is one of the most precious rights of an Englishman. And the Americans knew that this had happened in England, and they wanted to make sure that it never happened here. So bills of attainder were outlawed in the Constitution. And by the way, there were no exceptions. There were a couple of exceptions, weren't there, to the habeas corpus, but not for bills of attainder. If you're arrested and you're charged with a crime, you must be tried. Now, what's the second thing? An ex post facto law. Well, very simply, ex post facto is a Latin term that means after the fact. Post means after, right? Facto means fact, after the fact. All right. The best way to explain this is to give you the example first. Let's say that you are going to school at Southeastern, but you live in Slidell, and you are finished with your classes, and you are in your car, and you're driving on Interstate 12 to Slidell, and you're being very careful to observe the speed limit. Right? You you've got it right on. As a matter of fact, you got it on 69. You want to be sure that you're not going to get caught for speeding. And so somewhere around the Goodby exit, you look in your rearview mirror, and there's a state trooper back there with a light, and he pulls you over, and you're sort of confused because you know you've not done anything wrong, and you ask the officer, "Excuse me, officer," and you got to do it politely, right? "Excuse me, officer, why did you pull me over?" And the officer says, "You were speeding." And you very respectfully say, "I beg your pardon, officer, but I was not uh, over the speed limit of 70. As a matter of fact, I had the cruise control on 69 to avoid any possibility of speeding." And the trooper at that point says, "Well, that's true, but we're getting ready to change the speed limit at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. The speed limit is going to be 65. And so I'm arresting you for breaking that speed limit that's not even in effect." An ex post facto law is a law that is not in effect at the time that you break that law. Once again, you see a pattern emerging here. This was something that was rather common in England. It was a way that the king and the parliament silenced their political enemies by making up stuff like this fundamentally. Article 1, Section 9, Paragraph 4 says no capitation. Okay, capitation. That's a fancy word for a tax. In fact, it's a special kind of a tax. It's what's called a head tax, where each person pays his share of the total tax. All right, let me give you an easy example. Let's say that the tax is $100 and there are 100 people. What is the share for each person? It's $1, right? A capitation is a personal tax. No capitation or other direct tax shall be laid, and we know that the word laid means created, unless in proportion to the census or enumeration herein before directed to be taken. Now, those words, unless in proportion to the census or enumeration herein before directed to be taken, in hopefully in your copy of the Constitution, it's either in bold or it's in italics or it's underlined or something, because that tells you that this part of the Constitution, even though it's still in the Constitution, it is no longer in effect. We don't have taxes where everybody pays the same anymore, do we? No. We have income taxes where the more money you make, the higher the tax is. A good little memory jogger is to remember this: the more you make, the more they take. Right? It is a graduated income tax. That's not the way Americans were taxed in the late 17 and early 1800s. Everybody paid their fair share. Paragraph 5 says no tax or duty, and a duty simply is another form of a tax. No tax or duty shall be created for articles exported from any state. In other words, there is no such thing as an internal tax in America. The United States government can tax its citizens. The United States government can tax um, goods that are brought in from other countries. States cannot do that. States cannot, um, if if uh, if England imports boots into Virginia, the only people who can tax those boots uh, is the United States government. Virginia cannot tax those boots. That's called an internal tax. no tax or duty shall be laid on articles exported from any state. And now, uh, you can you can tax uh, goods brought in from other countries, but you cannot tax goods that simply cross state lines. Number 6, no preference shall be given by any regulation of commerce or revenue to the ports of one state over those of another, nor shall vessels bound to or from one state be obliged to enter, clear, or pay duties in another. Okay. This is another one of these things where it sounds really confusing, but it's really not. All right, let's take the first part of that. No preference shall be given by any regulation of commerce or revenue to the ports of one state over those of another. All right, let's assume for just a moment that the state of Virginia is experiencing some real economic problems. While the state of Massachusetts is, their economy is just really growing by leaps and bounds. And let's further assume that both states are importing things from France, whatever that thing is. Okay, it doesn't matter. They're importing the same thing from France. And the United States has decided to tax that thing. Can they charge a different rate? Can they charge a different rate to help the Virginia economy grow, and charge a different rate in order to slow the Massachusetts economy down to where maybe it'll all even out? No, can't do that. No preference shall be given by any regulation of commerce or revenue to the ports of one state over those of another. Taxes like that must be applied equally. Can't play favorites. Even if the outcome would be a good outcome for Virginia, and that sounds like it might be a good outcome, you still can't do it. Nor shall vessels bound to or from one state be obliged to enter, clear, or pay duties in another. Now remember, ships coming in from another country into the United States can be made to pay these special taxes called duties. That's perfectly constitutional, perfectly legal. But a ship leaving New Orleans and headed to New York, the cargo of that ship cannot be taxed when it gets to New York, because once again, uh, New Orleans is in the interior of the United States. New York City is in the interior of the United States, and therefore, and everything that was made, that was shipped, was made in the United States. So you can't tax it. You can't play favorites. Now let me read that again. Nor shall vessels bound to or from one state be obliged to enter, clear, or pay duties in another state. Now, what happens if on the way from New Orleans to New York, the ship stops in Havana, Cuba, right? That's a different country, isn't it? Well, and they take cargo. They take on cargo in Havana. Oh, Cuba is big on making rum, so they load up on the rum. They just load that American ship up with rum. Um, when that ship gets to New York, can a duty be charged on the rum? And the answer is yes, because it didn't come from the United States. It came from another country. Uh, so you got to be really picky. You've got to be very careful here. If it starts in a United States state and it ends in a United States state without being interrupted, you cannot charge duties on any of the cargo. But if it's interrupted between point A and point B, you can charge taxes, but only on the part that came from outside the United States. Article 1, Section 9, paragraph 7 says, no money shall be drawn from the Treasury but in consequence of appropriations made by law, and a regular statement and account of the receipts and expenditures of all public money shall be published from time to time. Now, let's go back and talk about something that we've talked about before, and that's the so-called power of the purse. What branch of government has the power of the purse? And the obvious answer is the Congress has the power of the purse. But it doesn't have absolute power. Remember, Section 9 talks about the limitations on the Congress. Things that Congress cannot do, cannot create writs of habeas corpus, cannot create bills of attainder, cannot create ex post facto laws, right? Cannot do this and cannot do that. Here, the Congress cannot spend all the money it wants to, even if it's for a good purpose. In order for the Congress to spend money, requires a budget be created. And the Congress then can spend money, but it cannot spend any more money than is mentioned in the budget. No money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law, and a regular statement and account of the receipts and expenditures of all public money shall be published from time to time. And that's the budget. Fancy, that's a long sentence to take the place of one word, budget. A regular statement and account of the receipts, that's what's coming in, and the expenditures, that's what's going out, of all public money shall be published from time to time. All right. Article 1, Section 9, paragraph 8. Y'all have to forgive me tonight. I'm still suffering from allergies, except tonight, instead of coughing, my eyes are watering. Section 9, paragraph 8. Now, once again, this is stuff Congress cannot do. No title of nobility shall be granted by the United States, right? We don't have dukes and earls and kings and potentates, right? No title of nobility shall be granted by the United States. And no person holding any office of profit or trust under the United States, shall, without the consent of the Congress, accept of any present, emolument, that's money, emolument, any present, emolument, office, or title of any kind whatever from any king, prince, or foreign state. All right. Here's an example. You are a soldier, and you fight bravely, and you save the lives of some of your ally soldiers. Let's say it's France, right? There are French soldiers there, and you do something that's really brave, and you save the lives of these French soldiers. Can the French government show its appreciation by giving you a gift, giving you money, giving you a job, giving you a title? They can't do any of that. They cannot do any of that. Now they can give you a medal, right? Um, that's not that doesn't involve a lot of that doesn't represent a lot of money. But this other stuff, that it could mean considerable money for you. So it cannot be done. Now there are certain circumstances where it can be done, but it's really rare. What's the circumstance? If the Congress gives its approval. Let's read that entire second um, phrase there. And no person holding any office of profit or trust under the United States shall, without the consent of the Congress, accept of any present emolument, office, or title of any kind whatever from any king, prince, or foreign state. Now, what happens is um, Okay, I've done something that's really courageous, and they want to give me an expensive gift. Well, the United States normally would accept that gift, but I can't have it. The United States will tell the French government, we will be glad to accept your very generous gift on behalf of this soldier, but the soldier himself won't receive it. It'll go into the museum. It'll be put on display. There'll be a plaque there that tells how brave the soldier was and what he did, but he doesn't get the gift. If you have ever visited the National Archives in Washington, D.C., where the Declaration of Independence and one of the copies of the Constitution is stored, you know that before you get to the room where the Constitution and the Declaration where they're housed, you walk through what I call, in my mind, a treasure room. And this room is chock-a-block full of gifts that have been given to Americans, but the American was not permitted to take possession of it. It was accepted on behalf of the American people and stays in the hands. Oh, some of the most beautiful things you'd ever want to see in your life are in that treasure room, and they change the displays periodically because they got all kinds of stuff down in the vaults that have accumulated down there in the several hundred years that we've been a nation. All right, that ends the things that Congress cannot do. Article 1, Section 9. But we have an Article 1, Section 10. And what is Article 1, Section 10? These are things that states cannot do. Things that states cannot do. Article 1, Section 10, Paragraph 1 says, no state shall enter into any treaty, alliance, or confederation, grant letters of marque and reprisal, coin money, emit bills of credit, make anything but gold and silver coin tender in payment of debt, pass any bill of attainder, ex post facto law, or law impairing the obligation of contracts, or grant any title of nobility. All right. Article 1, Section 10 has two things in it, and they both involve the states. There are certain things that the states cannot do. Under no circumstances can the states enter into a treaty with another country, um, grant letters of marque and reprisal. Remember that full story? Um, Captured enemy ships would be sold, and the crews would divide up the money. That was legal because the ship had been given a letter of marque. We said that that was what gave legitimacy uh, to some of the uh, sailors during the War of 1812, like Jean Lafitte. If Lafitte had done that without a letter of marque, he'd have been a pirate, right? States cannot coin money. They cannot issue bills of credit, and they cannot make anything but gold and silver legal tender. Now, there are some things that nobody can do. States can't do it, and the national government can't do it. And here's the list of things that nobody can do. Pass any bill of attainder. The Congress can't do it, and the states can't do it. Create ex post facto laws. Congress can't do it, states can't do it. Create laws impairing the obligation of contracts. Nobody can do that. Or grant titles of nobility. Nobody can do that. So, there are a number of lists here in Article 1. The long list, very long list, is things that Congress can do. The powers that are given to Congress, things that Congress can do. Next, there's a much shorter list, but nevertheless, there's a separate list of things that Congress can't do. Then there's an even shorter list of things that states cannot do. And then last, there's an even shorter list of things that nobody can do. So, if you ever wonder if we have a limited government, if there are limits on the power of the national government and the state governments for that matter, all you got to do is read this portion of Article 1, and it'll tell you the limits on government. And that is all of Article 1. And I know that you thought we would never finish, but we did. But let's dive into Article 2, because we still have, 19 minutes or so on this lecture. So let's use our time wisely. Article 2 deals with the executive branch. Now, let me recap something that it's been a while. So let me refresh your memory and tell you that we have government. Our government has three branches. There is the uh, legislative branch, which is the Congress, which has two parts. There is the executive branch, which fundamentally is the president and his advisors. And then the third part is the judicial branch, which involves the federal court. And we are dealing now with the executive branch, presidency. Article 2, Section 1 says the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America. Now, it doesn't really define what the executive power is, does it? And there's a reason for that. It doesn't make a lot of sense to us today, but it made a lot of sense in 1787 when the Constitution was being written. Everyone, and I do mean everyone, assumed that George Washington was going to be the first president of the United States. And they were right. Not only did he serve 4 years, he served two 4-year terms. He served a total of 8. And remember, the people, they just thought that George Washington couldn't do anything wrong. And if he was going to be the president, the assumption was that he would not make any mistakes. He wouldn't do wrong. He wouldn't be a crook, blah, blah, blah. And so, um, the duties of the president, now there are some listed. There are some duties of the president listed, but certainly that it doesn't go into the depth, for example, of an Article 1. Section 1, Article 2, Section 1 says the executive power, whatever that is, shall be given to the President of the United States of America. Section 1, paragraph 1 continues by saying, and together with the Vice President chosen for the same term, be elected as follows. Now, what we're getting ready to talk about is how to elect a President of the United States. And not just that, but how to elect the Vice President of the United States as well. Now, let me spoil this story for you, and I hope I don't confuse you too much by telling you that much of Article 2, Section 1, Paragraph 1, especially in Paragraph 3, no longer works. We have changed this part of it. But we're going to have to learn how it was in order to know why it was changed to the way it is. So here we go. Paragraph 2 says, each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature of that state may direct a number of presidential electors. We just invented the Electoral College, right? We just invented the Electoral College. Equal to the whole number of senators and representatives to which the state may be entitled in the Congress. Okay, here's the question. How many members of the Electoral College will each state have? And the answer is simple. It really is. What you do, it's a formula, but it's a simple formula. You take the number of senators that the state has. Now, I can't hear you, but let me ask you the question. How many senators does each state have? And I hope that you just said two. Remember? Uh, Membership in the U.S. Senate is based on equality. It doesn't matter if you're low population Rhode Island or high population Massachusetts. Everybody gets the same number of U.S. senators, and that number has always been two. Right. So you take that number, and then you add it to the number of U.S. representatives a state has. Now that number varies because the number of U.S. representatives that a state has is based on that state's population. So they might have, now they can't have less than one, right? You got to have at least one. Uh, but the sky's the limit on the number of representatives that they can have. So you add the number of, excuse me, as you know, you add the number of U.S. senators that a state has. That's always two. And you add that to the number of U.S. representatives that that same state has, and that varies according to the population. Add those two together, and that is the number of members of the Electoral College that each state has. Now, let me read that in its entirety again, now that I've explained it. Each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct. In other words, there are no rules about selecting the members of the Electoral College. It is the legislature of each state that decides who is going to be going to be a member of the electoral college. All right. Each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors, presidential electors, equal to the whole number of senators and representatives to which the state may be entitled in the Congress. But no senator or representative or person holding an office of trust or profit under the United States shall be appointed an elector. Politicians need not apply, especially, now let's be specific. If you're a U.S. Senator, you cannot serve as a presidential elector. If you're a member of the United States House of Representatives, likewise, you cannot serve as a presidential elector. Now, that's paragraph 2. Now, here comes paragraph 3. And if you'll look at your copy of the Constitution, you'll notice that every word in paragraph 3 is in italics or it's bold or it's underlined or something to indicate that none of this applies anymore. Uh, so uh, how were presidents and vice presidents elected um, in the early days of the nation? Here we go. The presidential electors shall meet in their respective states. You know, many Americans have this vision in their head that at some point, all the members of the Electoral College get together in one place, I guess in Washington, right? They all get together at the same place and they cast their ballots for a president. That is not true. That's not even close to being true. The members of the Electoral College for each state meet in their state and they vote. The presidential electors shall meet in their respective states and vote by ballot for two persons, of whom one at least shall not be an inhabitant of the same state with themselves. Okay, so each member of the electoral college has two votes. They have two ballots. Now, under normal circumstances, they can vote. No, let me start. Let me stop right here and tell you that George Washington was not elected by the people of the United States in a direct election. No, uh, the people didn't vote for him at all. The legislatures of the individual states voted for George Washington. And by the way, he got all the votes. No one has ever done that since then. No one has ever got all of the votes of the Electoral College. And Washington didn't do it once, but he did it twice. That's how highly respected George Washington was. So you got two votes. Each elector has two votes. Now, you can use those two votes to vote for the same guy if you want to. But if one of the candidates for the presidency is from your home state, you've got to split your ballot. You can use one of your votes to vote for your home state boy, but you've got to use the other ballot and vote for somebody else. Now, don't ask me why, because I have never figured that out. People have tried to explain that to me, and I don't know. Either I don't get it, or more likely, nobody gets it. Nobody knows why they did that. All right. The presidential electors shall meet in their respective states and vote by ballot for two people, of whom one at least shall not be an inhabitant of the same state with themselves. And they shall make a list. Now, this is sort of logical. They shall make a list of all the people, all the persons voted for. Remember in high school when you were having student council elections in your homeroom? People would say, I nominate Billy, right? I nominate John. I nominate Phyllis. And then, and those names would be written on the board. And the teacher would say, okay, everybody for John, raise your hand. And John got 10 votes. And so you, right? All of y'all who are for Phyllis, raise your hand, right? This is very similar to that. And they shall make a list of all the persons voted for and of the number of votes for each, which list they shall sign and certify. They sign it and they certify it. In other words, they promise that these are the names of the people who received votes, and this is an accurate count of the votes that each person received. Sign it and certify it, and transmit sealed to the seat of the government of the United States. So they put it in an envelope and they seal the envelope and they send it to the Capitol. Now, why doesn't it say they sent it to Washington, D.C.? Well, it's very simple. Washington, D.C. did not exist in that very first election. They were still trying to figure out where the new Capitol was going to be built. And so they don't say send it to Washington. They simply say send it to the Capitol. No, well, they call it the seat of the government, okay? The Capitol. Directed to the President of the Senate. And remember, uh, there are two really important offices. There are a number of really important offices, but two of those important offices in the Senate are the President of the Senate, who is at the same time the President of the United States, and there is the President pro tem of the Senate, and he is the person who serves as the President of the Senate when the President of the Senate can't be there. So the electoral votes from each state are sent to the President of the Senate, who is also the Vice President of the United States. The President of the Senate shall, in the presence of the Senate and House of Representatives, all right, let's stop. When the House of Representatives and the Senate meet in the same room, it's called a joint session of Congress. And that joint session of Congress usually meets in the chambers of the House of Representatives because it's so much bigger than the chamber that's built for the U.S. Senate. But nevertheless, the President of the Senate shall, in the presence of the Senate and House of Representatives, open all the certificates, and the votes shall then be counted. Now, it doesn't say exactly how to do this, does it? But generally, it will be done aloud so that God and everybody can hear who what candidate gets what number of votes. The person having the greatest number of votes shall be the president if such number be a majority of the whole number of presidential electors appointed. So, getting the most votes does not get you elected president. What elects you? Having the most votes that is a majority. And a majority, of course, is simply one more than 50%. Open all the certificates, and the votes shall then be counted. The person having the greatest number of votes shall be the president if such number be a majority of the whole number of presidential electors appointed by the states. And if there be more than one who have such a majority and have an equal number of votes, in other words, what if there's a tie? What if two people have the same number of electoral votes? It's entirely possible. It's happened twice in our nation's history. It happened once in 1800, and it happened again in 1824. It hasn't happened since then, but it has certainly happened. If such a number be a majority of the whole number of electors appointed, and if there be more than one who have such majority and have an equal number of votes, then the House of Representatives shall immediately choose by ballot, by voting, one of them for president. So here's the scenario. The first scenario is that somebody wins outright, right? They clearly win. What's the second scenario? Nobody wins. It's a tie. In the case of that, then the election of the president, pardon me, will be determined by the House of Representatives. Now, let me say this very clearly. If there's a tie, the Electoral College does not keep on voting until a clear winner emerges. The Electoral College votes once, once only. If there's a tie, the Electoral College they're already uh, at home, kicked back with a cup of coffee, right? If there's a tie, the election of the president goes to the House of Representatives. And if no person have a majority, then from the five highest on the list, the House shall in like manner choose the president. So here's the third scenario. What's the first scenario? Somebody wins clearly. They win outright. Second scenario is there's a tie vote and the election goes to the House of Representatives between the two high vote, the two high vote getters have the same number of votes. But there's a third scenario here. What happens if it's not a tie, but nobody has a majority? And that's entirely possible. Okay, let me ask that question again. What happens if nobody has a majority, nobody has a majority, and it's not a tie? Well, in that case, then the from a maximum in that case, five the names of the five highest vote getters for president will be considered by the House of Representatives. Now, of course, it assumes that there were as many as five running. But if there were five or more who were running, then the top five, the names, the top five vote getters will be from that list. The House of Representatives will choose the winner, will choose the president from that list of five. But in choosing the president, the vote shall be taken by states. In other words, the clerk of the uh, House of Representatives will call the roll, right? Vermont, how do you vote? Massachusetts, how do you vote? Right? Virginia, how do you vote? The vote shall be taken by states. The representation from each state having one vote. So, if there are five, or if there are as many as five candidates, when they start to vote, it will be a roll call vote, and each state will say, I support candidate A, I support candidate B, I support candidate C, I support, right? But when they do that, each state only has one vote. The representation from each state having one vote. And then it throws this weird word in. The word is quorum. Quorum. Now, many people are confused by this word, and I don't know why. Because a quorum has a really simple definition. A quorum is the number of people who have to be present in order to conduct business. A quorum for this purpose shall consist of a member or members from 2/3 of the states. So, what's the quorum in the House of Representatives in order to elect the president? It's 2/3 of the states. Right? We got 50 states now. So, how many states would comprise a quorum? 2/3 of 50. What's that? 37. But in choosing the president, the vote shall be taken by states, the representation from each state having one vote. A quorum for this purpose shall consist of a member or members from 2/3 of the states, and a majority of all the states shall be necessary for a choice. So, who wins? The guy with the majority. In every case, after the president has been chosen, after the choice of the president, the person having the greatest number of votes of the presidential electors shall be the vice president. So, what am I really saying? I'm saying that the second place guy becomes vice president. The guy who comes in second becomes the vice president of the United States. Now, what I'm really saying, in other words, is that no one back then ran for vice president. Everybody ran for president and for president only. It's unlike today, where a specific candidate runs for uh, president and a totally different person runs for vice president. It wasn't like that at all. Everybody ran for president. The guy with the most votes, if it was a majority, became the president, and the guy with the second most votes becomes the vice president. In every case, after the choice of the president, the person having the greatest number of votes of the presidential electors shall be the vice president. But if there should remain two or more who have equal votes, the Senate shall choose from them by ballot the vice president. So you've already chosen the president. What happens if uh, there's a tie for the second place? Well, if that's the case, the Senate will choose the vice president in a similar fashion to the way the House of Representatives chose the president. And that's a good place to stop. I ran over about 3 minutes, but that's fine. Okay. That is the end of this lecture, and we will see you soon.